Right, let's start. Tim and Anthony, may we start? I did forget to say that Tim is with the Landscape Architecture Department course at the Bartlett, so thank you for representing the new Landscape Architecture program at the Bartlett. And to chair this session, Alfredo Ramirez, who actually leads the landscape urbanism course at the AA, is going to chair this session. So thanks very much, Alfredo.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm really sorry I missed yesterday's in this morning presentation, which has been told have been amazing. And I don't know if there is the recording or there will be the recording available, which good. It's good news for me at least. Anyway, let's just move to next presentations. We have Eric, and we will have Harsh. No, it's a good way of pronouncing your very difficult name. And well, Eric is an architect gardener, which is very interesting way of presenting himself, and he will talk about architectural soils. So let's just go for it. And
Thank you. And thank you to the Monsoon Assemblages for organizing this event. It's really inspirational. It's been a really fantastic range of insights. So yes, I'm a gardener architect, and through my practice I have designed with many soils. Am I speaking too loud? No? Some are in the ground, and some are on buildings. It's worthwhile maybe explaining a little bit about my research, which is through reflective practice. So the main aim of my research is to find and investigate ecological ways of designing. So it's a lot about the how we design ecologically, with a particular focus on how to design with the emergent natures of places, with this creative quality that ecosystems have, as opposed to what we usually see in the modern world, which is blocking the processes, the creative processes, and also destroying the knowledge which is already within ecosystem. The method of this practice I have recently described in a PhD, which I completed in June. And I describe the ontology of the practice as a form of architectural animism, a secular form, where I am designing with places as actants. In this thesis, the soils are regularly mentioned, but they're mentioned in the background, in the way almost as a gardener's medium, to guide the propensity of the places by defining their affordance for growth. The next stage of the research is to investigate how this principle, which have been developed generally on very private properties or with relatively simple social networks, into more contested situations. And in doing so, I'm really trying to deal with the question of the political, dealing at a much broader, more complex scale. And I wish to give a more explicit voice to these other beings, to the ecosystems. For this symposium, I've obviously been, I've been looking at the soils more than the ground, and the soils that I've designed with. And I wish to look at 5 questions. How does my practice communicate with soils? What are soils in this exchange? What do we say to, or what information do we exchange with each other? How have we both changed in the process? And what does this reveal on the role of the architectural design in ecological politics? The method used is epistolary. First, I wrote a letter to the soils, but I realized that this did not give them a strong enough voice. So I wrote one back from the soils to me. And this is, of course, a dangerous anthropomorphic exercise, which is probably why I didn't do it first, because obviously an ecosystem is unlikely to have a language similar to ours. And there's absolutely no assumption that the letter is representative of what souls would say or think. This tool is used to investigate an ecological relationship to force humans, myself, and you, to empathize with soils, to develop some form of respect. Inevitably, it is like any other method, imperfect. It is somewhat foolish and has touches of romanticism, which I increasingly see as a positive after years of actually trying to deny that side. This is a test to see today, because it's the first time I've done this, and I've just done it last week, so it's very, very fresh, and I don't know what I think about it myself, but it's to test its utility, and I'd be very interested to hear your feedback later. So, dear Eric, thank you for your recent letter. We have been touched by your message and the way you have physically touched us over the years. Words are not really our language, so we are translating through web-based software. Please excuse us if the output doesn't quite convey our being. Just now, we were trying to translate the feeling we have when you dig into us, and it was translated as pain, although it isn't the digging per se that hurts us, as the violence of the digging if it happens in overly large quantities and or too regularly. Whereas for you animals, a cut is always painful and dangerous to health, potentially. For us, small amount of disturbance is enjoyable. It gives us energy to create new ecological organizations and new species. Inconsiderate digging, on the contrary, as per industrial agriculture, launches processes of decay, collapse in species, population, and range. You humans can be so ruthless in the way you communicate with us. We often feel that your species are not aware of our presence. With some exceptions, such as yourself, at least now. Of course, we can't express ourselves virtually through language or drawings, but it is not because we can't speak that we can't express an opinion on what we favor. You ask how we perceive the world. We touch. We feel physical presence through the plants as they get trampled under our steps, as you mow the grassland or cut trees. We also taste the decaying matter that enriches the soil or its absence when you cart the hay away. We taste you when you piss on us and enjoy the nitrogen and phosphate of the urine. We see through the plants as they grow and produce sugars more abundantly. Sorry, I need to read this. We see through the plants as they grow and produce sugars more abundantly where there is more light. We feel this through the flows of nutrients and water that run through our fungal networks. That also connects to the mineral subsoil. We taste the geology as much as the above ground. We also hear you through the animals that retreat in their burrows when you arrive. In response, plants grow according to these new conditions. You feel us through the plants and animals. They communicate what is happening below. You can read levels of nutrients, acidity, water, through how tall they grow and which species grow. Your responses tend to be that you cut us, which changes nutrients and light, and sometimes you change our setting, the topography or the hydrology, and we grow in response. A dialogue develops over days, weeks, months, years. We read the timing of these cuts, when in the year, how often, whether the cut is taken away. There are quick responses in days, weeks, or months, and the slow responses and change in the soil structure and nutrients levels over years and decades. We probably sense and evolve a little slower than you. Just like humans, we are multiple species assemblages. You also are made of other beings, your hair for your sense of touch. You also need bacteria to digest food. Your mind is similarly an emergent network of synapses and neurons that store information in a dynamic and complex set of emergent interactions. Our main difference to animals may be in our capacity to separate, to fragment. This does not mean, though, that we are inert matter, that this division isn't breaking connections. We may be best described as colonies that can subdivide, formed of smaller beings, not unlike plants, from which you can take a cutting. But don't make the mistake to think that we are only this friable matter that you use to report plants, compost. This is such a misunderstanding, and you know this implicitly. Think of your projects that use us. Arrange them in the order of soil types, following the process of succession, where soils start from mineral and gradually increase to deep woodland soils. Let's start with lichen house, this project that you clad with cementitious board that is porous enough to support lichen growth. Implicitly, although unconsciously, you know that this is already a soil. Organic matter growing on mineral matter, the very beginning of us. Eventually, some of the lichen dies and composts into micro amounts of humus, which will evolve into thicker soils when moss starts growing. Our dialogue here is mostly our monologue. You created the setting, and we grow. And you look at this response and let it be. This soil is gardened by the weather, the rain that brings water, and the sea wind that brings nutrient, and also takes away the built-up of humus, and thus stops this process of succession, so that the roof doesn't become grassland. You have often been in conversation with grassland soils, cutting them through various rhythms and patterns, sometimes leaving the cuttings to decompose and enrich us, sometimes removing them to enhance the diversity of species in the sward. Grasslands are diverse when not so rich in nutrient. Here, you disturb the process of succession. It was really sweet to see when you realized that we were not as uniform as you thought, that the dynamic mosaic of plants and animal communities move across over time in response to differences in soil depth and humidity and their interaction, not unlike the patterns of lichen. And you also notice how the topsoil slides down slopes over decades, accumulating in the lower parts. You also work with woodland soils, the climax of soils, that of the largest amount of organic matter stored. In Roots Pavilion, you have shaped it as an arch, originally held in shape with a corset of metal and building felt. And as it decays, this will be replaced by the roots of the trees planted at the top. You know implicitly that we can only exist with plants in order to be structurally resilient. You were reminded of this as you discovered the liquid quality of the soil when you were making the third size model. The plants are not only our sensing organs, they also form our epidermis. They protect the surface from steps, they stop erosion. Without plants, we don't exist. We just blow away. You know this when you detail roof gardens without parapets and draw the enmeshment of roots at the edges. Can you see now how we form a protective skin to the earth? How we limit erosion by constant renewal of the surface? How we are both a messenger between and made out of both the mineral below and the dead and living organic matter above? How the plants are part of us as the epidermis, protecting, structuring, and sensing. You asked in your letter, what do we say to each other? It isn't directly meaning that we exchange. On one hand, it is tangible elements such as nutrients, bodily fluids, cut hay, forage food, timber, and the other ecosystem services. But there is through these intangible ones that have tangible consequences, the care and respect that we show to each other. In the landscape of heavy industrial agriculture and intense mechanization, you protect us, both through defining protective zones and through acting on us with respect by being attentive. You have created spaces where ecological processes can emerge, although they, of course, are tweaked. You protect us also through the aesthetic language you create with us, these picturesque or geometric forms that you apply with various cutting regimes. Not only are they beneficial by gently disturbing us towards higher levels of resilience, they also change the behavior of the humans that visit. People start to walk only on paths. The aesthetic language makes visible our diverse textures, frames them, and makes them approachable. We first laughed at these seemingly superficial aesthetic decisions, and now realize that they are a translating tool, frameworks that form a regime of perception that allows humans that can't feel us to become attentive. You have sometimes hurt us, especially in the early, clumsy days. For example, when you harvested the hay every year in the less rich meadows. And after a while, we were so emaciated that little grew. It took you a few years to hear us cry, even though you were looking. You so believed in the concepts of meadow conservation management you had read that you couldn't feel us. You now can read us more precisely and decide in response how often to harvest, depending on each location. You have detailed awareness of the dynamic of the meadow mosaic and a variety of techniques to adjust to changes. In your latest landscape gesture, compost circle, you add decomposed hay in a circle in an area of low nutrient to see how the plant communities changes accordingly. The texture and range of species that it brings, the changes in height. Through this respect and care, we have learned from each other what we each thrive on, and reach through that exchange a point of aesthetic, ethical synergy. On one hand, we enjoy the loose disturbances that you enact as they make us more diverse, more resilient, more alive. The way the large mammals used to disturb us in the prehistoric times. On the other, you appreciate the diverse texture we create as a response that express levels of equilibrium, levels of biodiversity, of resilience. This was not always the case. Your taste has changed. You preferred more colorful and smoother textures. We also are not the same. We were less diverse and rougher. Like an old couple, we are more like each other. Through our dance of co-creation, you have become, in some ways, ecological. You already had the inclination from the start, but you were so clumsy, walking on our feet. We have become more human, more you, in order to please. In the same way as some fruiting trees and flowers have evolved to embed their DNA, the taste and aesthetic sense of humans, in order to thrive. We have developed ecologies that please you. You have learned our character as we have learned your culture. When you started working with us, you saw design as something done in a studio and then applied on the world. Now you see design as a dialogue, working with what is here, now, with our vibrant, messy, and unpredictable diversity. Design is no longer predetermined, it is emergent and distributed within the ecosystem. Please don't think of your role as being our steward. Don't feel responsible for maintaining us, but keep conceiving us as a creative being that maintains itself when you let it do so, and that you can create with. You don't repair us, you help us to repair ourselves. And in this process, you are also repairing yourself, aren't you? Thank you for being present and respectful. Thank you for creating modes of communication between us and humans. We are looking forward creating with you. Take good care of yourself. Signed, the souls you have designed with. And now I'd just like to point, maybe, well actually, if I have the time, 4 points, but let's do the first 3 anyway. The first is that this exercise has been really useful for me to understand souls in a very different way, as this very thick skin, including the plants. And this understanding is relevant purely for my practice. I mean, it might be relevant to others, but that's how I am engaging with that understanding. The second is this discovery of how much we might have influenced each other. And I'm not exactly sure what this really means, but there's a kind of human earthiness and earthy culture that comes from that. And the last is I'm starting to see this form of disseminated architectural design as an example of a mode of communication between human and non-human. One that has, that I would like to investigate in the sense of these democratic processes that could be used with this concept of the parliament of things of Bruno Latour. And that's something that I would really like to take into the next stages of the research. Have I got the time for a 4th point? Yeah. After hearing Tim last night, I brought back this drawing which I had taken out, and he was talking about, and actually multiple people talked about this movement of upwards and downwards. And this is a sketch that I made for the design of a front garden on which there was an existing concrete slab. And my instinct was to pierce the concrete slab and plant trees so that the trees, as they grow, break the slab. And I think that it's very much an instinct of actually starting to break this concrete slab that stopped these processes of erosion and this downward process of burying by starting the process of fragmentation of that surface. And that kind of parallels also some of the discussions with concrete that we had earlier. And I find one of these things which is interesting about research through practice is that sometimes that instinct is dealing with things that you can't, at that point I had no understanding that this is the kind of thing I was dealing with. So anyway, food for thought probably. Thanks.
Yeah, and now we have Harsh, who will be talking about Monsoon Forest.
Oh no, that's fine. Yeah, put it on the slide. It's clearer on the slide, actually. Wonderful to be here this evening. Thanks for your solidarity, for sticking around. I'm a PhD student with the Monsoon Assemblages project, and these annual conferences have been very special moments for me, because the monsoon, I mean, I'm sure every PhD student finds a personal project with a PhD, but the monsoon in a way took me back to this realization of this condition of life which enables everything that makes the life world that most of the humans I've known in my life to be possible. And so in a way, this conference in particular has been in a way a repetitive moment. I mean, it's happened twice, this is the 3rd time. A point of reflection and contemplation of the monsoon becoming a kind of political project. my PhD being about the air of the monsoon attached with the New Delhi National Capital Region is trying to do a more than human new materialism project with aerosols and forests really above the ground, and it's in solidarity with a lot of the things said today. But what I want to do in the next 15 minutes is essentially to share with you some of the recent political tensions I've been thinking with in relation to fieldwork, and of course, this being an election year in India, where we anticipate a right-wing government coming back into power, some of the implications for life with the monsoon in 2019 and years to come. So the task I've had with the work, with the air, was always to keep the analytics slightly suspended from the ground. And this is something Lindsay Bremner told me very early on, was the project was to really just keep it slightly suspended from the ground, and then you begin to see how the air transforms worlds. And that's where you find the ground in the air. And one of those ways has been through the Monsoon Forest. And the Monsoon Forest that I've been attuned with, again, in a very, very brief way, but also an urban way with the Delhi region was with the Aravalli Range, which edges on its eastern edge in Delhi, which is home to a range of different communities. But anyway, sorry. The reason I put this up there was to just signify that these are some of the questions I'm unable to engage with. These are some of the questions I'm unable to answer. The Pari Archives is one of my scrolling joints where I just sort of think with articles and news pieces on rural India, which is uncovered, where moisture and the disappearance of moisture and the air forcing life out of the ground is performing a large-scale transformation of life as we know it. And this is a very different transformation from a Churchillian genocide of, for British and European futures. So it's not essentially anthropogenic violence in a conventional way. It's a celebratory violence in a way performed by the air itself. It is telling us that we have no agency against it. So as you can imagine, when I see images like this, it just gets my blood boiling. And just to explain what this image is, on February 11th, 2019, NASA published a fascinating report. From the mid-1990s, Ranga Maini and others have been trying to describe something of a greening phenomena on the Earth's surface. Drawing from 20 years of data from NASA's moderate resolution imaging spectroradiometer, which has been extensively used in this conference, which is able to generate data on vegetation to the level of 500 meters on the ground, NASA made the claim, and I quote from the news report, "The world is a greener place than it was 20 years ago." They argued that this effort led by India and China, efforts of greening and afforesting, which is a very important word here, so stay with that, have succeeded in multiplying vegetation on the Earth's surface. I quote, "Taken all together, the greening of the planet over the last 2 decades represents an increase in leaf area on plants and trees equivalent to the area covered by the Amazon rainforest." I want to pause and think about the scale of this greening imagination. This news hit me like a brick because all of my research as a PhD student was essentially informing me that the condition of life was being taken away. But here you had folks telling me, oh wait, there is actually more greening happening on the Earth. What does this mean for sites that one is attached with, sites that one is trying to draw from, sites or humans and non-humans that one can possibly speak with? What happens when the ground then is sort of inverted? And this is where my first quarrel of the day begins. This is my first argument. A spectroradiometer science of the Earth's surface teaches us many interesting things about the world and its anthropogenic transformation, but it conveys absolutely nothing about the politics and complexity of life. This is not life, and its images attempt to speak to a life that does not exist. The image might be of the Earth, but it is not my Earth, and I don't mean for that to be a conservative reference, but this is not an Earth of livability. The image, in some sense, as many have argued in this conference, is the Anthropocene itself, a grand opening of science and the illiteracy articulated by the same science and the same time in the same sentence. Let me tell you why, and let me use this opportunity to gesture to a different kind of sentence in drawing from what Anna Singh thanks of Donna Haraway, a paper I'm sure many of you have read in this room, and I quote, "For the permission she offers us to be both scientist and cultural critic, that is to refuse the boundaries that cordon nature from culture, and besides to dare tell the history of the world in a single sentence." I position this also in protest to a comment made yesterday about the play of words. Wordplay, said somebody in the audience, can be poetry about a walk in the park. But wordplay, I say, can also be the instrumentalization and orchestration of worlds for the living and the non-living, both human and non-human, with the monsoon and everything that is in it that is living. So in the spirit of words, let me introduce you to the Monsoon Forest. And if you just notice the white patch here, this is the Aravalli Range, and Delhi is approximately over here, and this is the Thar Desert. And that's essentially a geological range that is receding, and so just stay with that little figuration inside that map inside your heads for the next 10 minutes. And this is a terrible atlas, but that's sort of where the Aravalli Range is, just to give you an idea of the situatedness of this particular conversation. This is not the Monsoon Forest at Chester Zoo, and this is not the Monsoon Forest of your inboard airline magazine advertising monsoon forest safaris. Pradeep Krishan offers us a valuable definition of a monsoon forest. For trees, Delhi is in drought for 10 months of the year. Delhi's forests are monsoon forests. Contrary to a rainforest, and I quote from Pradeep, the rhythm of a monsoon forest is attuned entirely to one concentrated pulse of rain that happens every year at a more or less predictable time. A state of perceived dryness is the material condition for the monsoon forest. The monsoon forest, by its very definition, offers us a certain kind of holding of the air and the water in its body for the rest of the year. Monsoon forests, most importantly, are forests that think with the monsoon, become with the monsoon, and all of those semiotic, more than human connected terminologies that you've heard of listened to in this conference, and in more ways than one, produces an affective and multi-species regime of monsoonal worlds. Now, earlier this month of March, we're in March, the government of Haryana, which is Delhi, well, a certain part of extended Delhi is in Haryana. So for those who are not familiar with the part of the world, welcome to Haryana. The government of Haryana tabled an amendment to the Punjab Land Preservation Act of 1900, the Punjab Act. Note that India became a nation in 1947. Punjab in the 1900s, part of the British Raj, was territory open for vegetal experimentation and fantasy. The legislation as described by the State Forest Department even today, as of 2019, was set out for the purpose, and I quote, to save the soil from erosion in Punjab and Haryana, in the Shivalik Hills, which is part of the Aravalli Range, which are prone to soil erosion due to water and airflow. The law introduced restriction in the 1900s that essentially made it really hard for indigenous and other local communities to graze cattle and maintain their life relations with these now classified forests. They were not classified as forests before. The law, as an act of privatization, essentially was arguably part of the wordplay implemented by power to regulate a forest and extract from territory resources for the joy of violence and control. But you also hear, as one can argue via Con, that seems to be a semiotics of the human with language and the worlds that language produce through the enforcement of language. So on 27 February, the Haryana government, with its amendments to the Punjab Land Preservation Act of 1900, essentially opened up the Aravalli Range for real estate investment and development, at least over 80,000 acres in the state of Haryana itself. The Aravalli Range, as a geological parcel of ancient quartzite rock, which is really hard rock, is a descending piece of geological infrastructure. As the writer Pranay Lal beautifully articulates, and I quote Pranay, "It took 2 billion years of shoving and pushing of tectonic plates and magma outpourings to create these ancient fold mountains. The speculative descent of these mountains and the emergence of the Himalayas, as what Maharaj Pandit calls the invention of the monsoon, forces us to think about the production and design of life and the way life itself, semiotically, as Eduardo Kohn and as the Malhar comrade earlier mentioned, relates back and creates a certain kind of condition of speech. The amendments were met with significant protests from opposition parties and environmental groups. The Supreme Court of India on 1st March intervened in protest and provocatively asked the Haryana government, and I quote, "You think you are supreme, and I promise you this is not a brand endorsement." The court announced, and I quote, "We will not allow such kinds of misadventure. You are not above the law. Legislature is not supreme. It is really shocking that you are trying to destroy forests." And that is the Supreme Court. And therefore, the government of Haryana could not support the builders, and it could not essentially go ahead with this proposal. Now, this is where things get interesting, and this is where friends will ask me, "But Harsh, your project is about the air. How did we get to rocks and the law?" You see, the Punjab Land Preservation Act, passed in 1900, is also the very same act that facilitated the introduction of a species called Prosopis juliflora. Prosopis juliflora is a shrub, it's a thorny shrub, it's a legume, it's an afforestation plant that's been used for ages by the British Empire and other forms of power interested in afforestation. Locally known as Vilayat-e-Kikar, and Vilayat-e-Kikar means the foreign kikar, or the white colonial kikar. It's not an oppressive kikar, but it's a kikar that spoils things. So I just want to make that distinction, that this is a kikar that spoils something and doesn't oppress. So it doesn't hold the coloniality that classical theories of power has. So the alternative name of the plant is actually a term that talks about spoiling things. It's not really about oppressing. And so the plant, in a way, is a plant that extends the agency of spoiling things for humans. If we consider for a moment that the ecologies of the ground are also ecologies of the air, then this allows us to enter a space of aerial roots, supplanted and re-related in other worlds. As Natasha Myers has argued, and as Eric, right before this talk, has argued, plants are a power and force to be reckoned with. To summarize some of the basic work of Prosopis juliflora really quickly, which is known as an invasive species now in the Aravalli range in many parts of India, it has arguably eliminated in parts of the Aravalli range up to 90% of the local biodiversity. I really want you to take that statistic and really think about what that would look like. It taps deep into the groundwater, and it has toxic alkaloids in its roots and thorns, and so it deters the growth of other plants around it. It has literally changed the biome and has shifted the navigational routes of several bird species. We today have satellite maps of the invasion of Prosopis juliflora in many parts of North India. It is arguably the most hated plant in India today. And it all began as a project of governing the air, as an aesthetic regime that is required by the state and the fantasy of Louis Vuitton's Delhi to create forest spaces, create inclusions and exclusions. Like the letter from the soil that we have heard from Eric, it is known that Lieutenant Colonel Bedome, the conservator of forests in Madras, which Anthony works on, in 1876 sent a letter to the secretary to the Revenue Department of Madras suggesting the acquisition of the seeds of Prosopis juliflora from South America to be grown in Madras and the arid regions of Tamil Nadu. Facilitated through interlocutors right here in the Kew Gardens, the species was introduced in India in the 1900s and in Delhi through the imperial gardener Musto, who assisted Louis Vuitton in his project of designing New Delhi. There are some beautiful stories about how Musto himself would plant the seeds in the ground. And there's some very interesting stories about the then king of Jodhpur in Rajasthan, who ran one of the first flying clubs in India, who basically took parcels of these seeds and just blasted these seeds from the air all across Rajasthan and the Jodhpur region. The point I'm trying to make through this entire invasive species is that the monsoon forest in time has become a metaphor. And this is a transformation from material to metaphor, and something that we think we know, and something that refuses to exist anymore, but becomes something completely different. From a living material to a living metaphor of possibilities in the margins, and there's a lot of work on native ecologies going on right now. I'm not claiming any of that work. I'm not claiming I have access to that work. But interestingly, scientists that study these invasive species will also tell us that Prosopis juliflora has also learned to become monsoonal. And this is where it gets really PhD-ish, so I'm not going to push it further. But just to give you the scale of this species, and one of the reasons why I don't want to use the plant as an object is because it's not an object. It's a form of life, and it's essentially found place in this soil, and it's producing new air. This is Tughlaqabad Fort, by the way, which is basically Old Delhi, and it's just it's just a skyline of this one species. It's a monoculture crop that is completely unplanned. It's what Anna Singh calls unintentional. Okay. I don't want to dig further into this due to a lack of post-lunch affective time, but I want to engage with the monsoon as a political air and ground, and as monsoon forests as troubled ways, inherently traumatizing, and yet the only way to seek monsoon relations out from the non-human ground. As Deborah Bird Rose argues, this is the end of ethical time. Extinction and emergent life, as Eben Kursky might argue, are entangled forms and processes. Heeding to Natasha Myers's call on thinking with the Planthropocene, a concept that some of you might be familiar with, how might we navigate the complex processes that force us to recognize difference, that all forms of life are not the same, they do different things, they create different forms of life worlds, even between plants. And to push it further, how might we think of the Planthropocene, Natasha Myers's provocation, in a project of afforestation, which eliminates monsoon forests and produces a climatic analytic telling you that there are more forests today than there were earlier. Commenting on the project of afforestation, Christian has rightly argued that afforestation is a sham. The Forest Department knows nothing about forests. Commenting on the Delhi State Department decision to fell 16,000 trees last year when I was actually doing field work in the world's most polluted city, in a way planting trees elsewhere, sanctioning it as a project of displacing trees here and enabling trees there. Afforestation is madness. Afforestation can claim to make a life world, but it is not a project of care. It is not a project of creative more than human collaboration, and it is most definitely not a project that is monsoonal, because afforestation is caused through the uprooting of monsoonal life. It is arguably the ultimate form of detachment and becoming consciously anthropogenic, ourselves becoming aerosols. And I'm closing here, so stay with me. This is becoming increasingly clear with the emergence of pre-monsoonal and now increasingly monsoonal dust storms. And if you want to entertain yourself, just try YouTubing some of last year's dust storms in Delhi and dust storms in the west of India, which have really learned how to transcend pre-monsoonal time in entering monsoonal time. And it's becoming hard through these processes to tell exactly when the monsoon begins and when it ends, because a meteorologist will tell us that the monsoon starts on a certain day, ends on a certain day, because they can track the movement of moisture and the clouds. Delhi, as of 2019, is in the register for Indian cities with high exposure to the process of desertification. Previous studies have shown that over 60% of the city has already been desertified. The call for afforestation since the British Raj to protect the city from the dust still today remains the same call for afforestation to protect the city from dust storms. Our methodologies have not changed, but the air has. The Union Ministry and the Supreme Court of India have for some time been involved in the question, how do we define forests? Union Ministry definitions have generally favored corporations over indigenous communities. The Supreme Court of India in 1996 ordered the dictionary definition of a forest. The Oxford Dictionary defines a forest, and I quote, as a large area covered chiefly with trees and undergrowth. As language reframes life, and as the capital scene forms an emergence in dust, displacing all and every form of indigenous, non-human, and human life, this detachment from the monsoon is a time that is altered, where the air holds the performance of the methodology, and we have lost the plot. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Well, thank you for the presentations. Very thought-provoking. Very different, but in a similar, but in many ways very similar topics. I have to say, I was not aware, let's say, of any of your work, and I found it very, I have to say, inspiring in the way you speak your own work and your own research. And something that I found very interesting is, and that is important today, is how we redefine our relation with nature, no? Because perhaps it's one of the, well, if not the main issue, one of the main issues of today, no? That influence the way we follow our life, no? We create our way of life. And somehow, something that I think, in general terms, links your two presentations is, on the one hand, a mentality, no? That has been driving the way we literally control the world, no? And perhaps there should be another way in which we change that mentality to relate with nature, to work with nature, to understand nature's, et cetera, no? And, and on the other hand is how that mentality foster perhaps a new language, no? That we have to embrace, or perhaps to produce, to actually allow that mentality to permeate, no? So in that sense, I'd like to perhaps you expand on those two issues that I think are important, no? Like how do we change mentalities, no? So we can actually perhaps generalize the kind of communication with souls through letters, perhaps, I don't know, and how we can use new language, no, to communicate that mentality. So.
First, I think there's something about the definition of the word nature, which is really useful. In my PhD, I use the concept that Freya Matthews developed of nature as a quality, as opposed to a thing. So, more in the sense of it's the nature of something to do something, and to think of the modern way of looking at the world, where you're effectively trying to make the world do a specific thing. So you're stopping that process of being and emergence. And in terms of the question of language, the letter is something that I hadn't tried before. So most of the focus on my research previously was about the ways. And actually, the language was not words. The language was actually actions and a certain way of engaging. So when drawings, for example, were done, such as the ones that I'm exhibiting over there, they were more a way of testing something that then is performed on the ground in reaction to what is actually there, what you can actually see. So sometimes I wonder whether the question is more of getting people more engaged physically into acts in order, and closer to the land, in order for them to be able to see. And that in a way, of course you need language to explain it, but actually it's much more in the performative and the experience of the performative that we might change society, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's obviously a concern, but I don't think changing mindsets is possible at all, actually. And I think that most agencies are actively participating in what Deborah Bird-Rose would call death work. So I think, in a way, I mean, with this example, in particular, I think if one is seeking stories of hope and stories of futures, I mean, there are always communities fighting for life as they know it, and I think that's an interesting place to stay with the complex processes and troubles, but as Haraway might phrase. But I mean, I don't see any possibility of changing mindsets, especially this being an election year in India. And I think there's been a collective transformation of desire and a collective transformation of humans to see value through violence. And I think that there's a lot of time left in our very short lives to see cycles of that unfold. And yeah, I think we should just see joy in the performance of the air and breath.
Thank you for both of you. I have a few remarks and maybe a question at the end. I really like the two of you speak about the agency of plants, actually, in worse or bad, in better or worse. And I like also the way you describe it through experience. It's a very pragmatist way of doing and being in relation with things, like the traditional philosophy of pragmatism, James Dewey Whitehead. And I really enjoy also the letter of taking care of a localized, we call it terrain de vie in French, like life terrain. And it makes me think about we need more maybe cosmopolitical design. I think it could be maybe a notion to go. And my question, I have also a remark about these cosmopolitical things. And so in a way, we are not the only one to design things, but plants become landscapers and designers. And that when we think of the book wrote by Emmanuel Ecocha, maybe you know it, La vie des plantes, Plant Life, pour une métaphysique du mélange, where he argues that actually plants make the atmosphere and that we breathe their outcome, so we live through them also, and they design the entire Earth, actually. And my question, maybe on the ground, it's about the notion of ecosystem services, which is now spread in design, and I wanted to know what you think about that.
Yes, I find the question of pragmatism is interesting. A lot of the methods that I was trying when I was doing my PhD, I was always coming back to this question of whether the method that is used is useful and has a utility, which I think is a pragmatist principle, that you're not judging a method because it's true or it's leading to a truth, but for its utility on the ground. So I see the letter in a way as one of these. Then the question of, we were talking about the plants having that will, and I think there's always this, with the work I always have this sense that there is two wills that are always constantly working with each other, and in a way we can look at, I can't remember the name of the tree that you're mentioning in your presentation. But there's clearly an opportunity for that tree to exist, which is not taken by something else, which maybe in the past was taken by something else, but it isn't anymore. And there doesn't seem to be any that much reaction from humans towards it. You know, it doesn't seem to be used as a crop or to be dealt with. So it just expands exponentially. And I'm thinking at the same time of permaculture principles about what you might actually do in a situation like this, not trying to stop it necessarily, but to either find a use for it so that automatically it will gradually recede a little, but still be present, but not as abundant, or whether you put another species in its place that might be culturally or ecologically less problematic or damaging.
No, thank you for the question, and thanks, Eric, for that comment. I mean, this is obviously 12 minutes, 15 minutes, and it's a curated story. And you know, I have a trouble with my voice, and so if I speak softly, you can't hear me. Like, you know, if I speak properly, then I have to force it out. And so a lot of people think I'm often assertive about like a position, but I hope I was clear that I don't think anybody's winning or losing in the performance or the story. It's really just about methodology. It's about a methodology of what we think a methodology is, but it actually being a performance of complete nonsense when, you know, the project itself is actually doing something completely different. So it's really about the air taking on and saying other stories when we think that Prosopis juliflora or afforestation can do something. So that's one. On Eric's comment, you know, so it's been really interesting. The World Bank funded a project to monetize Prosopis juliflora, and you can actually buy juliflora pod coffee from the market. And the king of Jodhpur thought that the wood from Prosopis juliflora can be used in the I mean, now obsolete World War II planes, the wheels of the World War II planes. He actually believed that, and they experimented with it. But Prosopis juliflora is used to make charcoal, is used to make, you know, firewood. To use it, so there are uses for Prosopis juliflora, and it's really not. And in fact, there's also a beautiful PhD by a Finnish anthropologist on how Prosopis juliflora is sacred in certain parts of Tamil Nadu. So people have learned to live with it. And so in a way, it's really not about violence, it's about transformation. And it's just about, it's about being disrespectful for recognizing the transformation that is happening. And it's really just this, this call to, maybe think of it differently, as many other comrades have done earlier, and but yeah.
Thanks, both of you. Those were fantastic. Where to begin? So I'll kind of build off of what Alexandra said it initially. So Harsh, I mean, when I saw that image as well and that story about the greening of the planet in the last 20 years, was just infuriating. And it kind of took me back because I think there's this idea that because we have more technology and we can see the Earth so clearly in such a high resolution from all of these satellites, that we know it better. But that map, I mean, it's one of many, but it's a kind of redrawn idea of a kind of simplification of what vegetation is and what it means. And that has a really long history. I mean, it goes back to colonial explorations and the kind of landscape zoning and mapping that was going on. And so like vegetation mapping being this kind of union between geography and botany. But in colonial purposes, sort of the botany was erased, like the characters were simplified to be sort of either money generating or not. And then that then directed the way that we drew landscapes, the way that we used hatch patterns or colors. So forest became green or really lush green or super dense hatches, and desert became barren space, right? Available for anything but worthless. And it was actually through sort of particular botanists, like André Auberville is one, and I just butchered that French name, and I apologize, is one that comes to mind because his work in the kind of French colonies in Africa was really exceptional in terms of really bringing out the importance of the micro characters of plants to understand the complex ecologies of deserts, right? And so I sort of want to I know in your hopeless ending that things can't be changed in a way, I sort of want to push back on this idea of not, I think it's right not to sort of push the object forward, but I wonder what you really think about sort of pulling out the kind of micro characteristics or the micro dynamics that prosopis then puts in place, that it puts into action within the airspace as your project kind of hovers above the ground just a bit. Because I think those things really are worth finding a way to represent. And I know for you that's not a graphic thing, perhaps. But these understandings are really important, and I think the more this idea that we have more technology and so therefore we have more understanding needs to be questioned, it needs to be prodded by something. And I think in a way it's a return to that exploration of micro characters. And for Eric, also with soils, I mean, I'm super fascinated by soils. And also about the micro characteristics of them, and so the way that they're sort of mapped. I mean, a whole huge island the soils could be mapped based on sort of 10 core samples across the whole thing. Then we make a bunch of assumptions based on slopes and where rivers are, et cetera, and then we decide what kind of thing is where based on what we can see from above, more or less. And so, but as you were explaining in your beautiful letter from soils, that all of the actions, all of our kind of foot shuffling and everything else kind of, it disturbs, it creates, like every time you dump something new on a piece of soil, it makes something unique. It's a whole new thing that never existed before. And so I wonder within your work, or if you've ever thought about different ways to really, I don't know, bring out somehow or explore the kind of uniqueness, these sort of micro characteristics of soils in different in situ that could bring a more in-depth understanding about our relationships with those grounds and those plants.
Thank you so much for that. No, I mean, I agree. I mean, obviously, no, I mean, so in the paper, which hopefully will manifest, I do actually engage with the cellular workings of the project and how rubisco and sunlight and moisture and the monsoon are sort of like all operating together, and in a way it is becoming monsoonal. But I think for this platform, for my 15 minutes, I think it's really about letting out a certain kind of political energy that I feel in my body at this point in time. And so it's really just about doing that and just having a conversation around that. But no, thank you so much for that comment. And yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm pessimistic. I think it's really just, I mean, Delhi lives as it desertifies. And so, I mean, you know, and it is currently the world's most toxic city. Yeah, I mean, you know, all the humans that I know have come up with stories to deal with that. And so I think, yeah, so it's really not it's really, I hope I'm not doing that. I think it's really just about settling with the politics first, and obviously there's a whole amount of work on the ecology here, on the legislation here, on the Gujars, for example, who are the indigenous community who have lived in the Aravalli Range. And so the map of the Gujars is actually the map of the Aravalli Range. And so there's such rich work in this area, and this is in a way one take to develop one argument in that body of work. And I'd highly recommend checking out, which you might also enjoy actually, Amita Bhaviskar's work on the presidential estates, and she does a beautiful chapter on gardening and how the practice of gardening in Lutyens Delhi, it's a really, really interesting story. It's an aesthetic inheritance, and what do you do with that inheritance? The desert has been greened, and so there's no going back, and so in a way you're just working with what's there, and yeah.
Yes, the question was about the micro, and in the work so far I've dealt a lot with the micro, but actually focusing on the plants and these very small variations, which I haven't really shown here, but a lot of particularly the patterns on meadows are effectively strong variations of plant communities or micro ecosystems, and so and these are very specific to a particular place. And occasionally we've added some plants, but actually, generally speaking, they're almost all plants that came by themselves. The ground is actually a focus that is new. So far, it was always an enabler more than actually the focus. So I'm not entirely sure how much I'm going to do with this yet. The only area that has been really capturing my interest for a number of years now are the question of erosion. And it happens on the piece of land where I do most of this landscape work in two places. One is that one of the boundaries is actually a small river, and they do have a tendency to change. And the question is whether you resist that change, or whether you let it happen, or whether you do something to increase the change. And I haven't yet actually come up with something that I really want to do, but it's one that really interests me. And the other place is that like on most countryside, particularly when the subsoil is waterproof, you end up with quite a lot of rivulets and mini streams. And on that kind of ground, farmers nowadays are trying to drain quickly in order to get an earlier crop and larger crops, which means that the water runs much, much quicker, and it erodes much quickly. So what used to be this ditches effectively suddenly get eroded incredibly quickly, particularly with the soil that we have, which is very old, volcanic, which is incredibly friable. And because we are at the bottom, we had this really huge amount of sand just effectively over time, over a period of 5 years, came really, really quickly. And it's there, and it keeps on eroding. And I think I will do something with it at some point, but I'm yet to really know what.
Thank you.
While David gets the mic, can I just quickly also add that, is David getting the mic? Can I really quickly add that it's an election year in India, and statistics like this are used all the time. I mean, so just to add that as well, that in a way epistemology wins, and epistemology always makes its way and says this is right and this is wrong. So.
Do we have time for more questions? I think there is one more. Okay.
Eric, the epistolary method, which I really appreciated, but then when you said it was pragmatic, then I was less sure, because when you were presenting it, it seemed like a problem of communication. And you could see soils as multi-species communities that are communicating all the time with everything. And to then reduce the problems and the difficulties of the moment to a communicative issue would maybe seem counterintuitive, especially if it's pragmatism and it's about practices and relationships. So it just seemed like a strange choice, the letter writing. If you could just take us through how that works pragmatically.
It's pragmatic in the sense of our human understanding of how they might work in a way that is useful for the practice of architecture. So what I find pragmatic about it is that I'm understanding soil differently now, which will help me practice. I'm not sure if it's pragmatic for the soils themselves, but I'm not sure that the soils necessarily. Do you see what I mean?
Should I? You? No? Okay. I think we don't have questions for that. I mean, I'm just intrigued that why you didn't answer the question about the environmental services. Sorry. Just because some of the issues that you touch upon is about also communication, and I think that also I want to refer to what Christina mentioned about the map. Because obviously there's that map that describes the greening of the planet, describes a way in which technology is telling us something that perhaps we should be describing in a different way, obviously, no? Because the way we communicate things, no? Produce changes, no? Creates awareness in people, creates reactions in people, no? If you were to describe that forest or that greening, either it's growing or decreasing, that will create reaction. I mean, it has obviously created some reaction on you, no? And that has changed parts of your mindset as well, no? But also, what I was saying about the ecosystem services is also, I think it's important to, I guess, to address that language, whether it's with words or with actions, no? Because that also refers to the way we relate again to nature. No? Like if we refer to nature as something that is giving us services, then it's different to something that we are working with, no? Or if we refer to, I don't know, environment as something alien to us that is just, rather than, I don't know, a living planet, it's also something important that perhaps refers to the work of you, Eric, no? Like, because you want to have this closer relation, no? With soils, with plants, etc. That certain words, no, like ecosystem services, perhaps, at least for me, doesn't, no, or at least detach you from that. So perhaps just a short comment because we have to move. And
I mean, you've opened a Pandora's box. I'm not going to engage with it, but just, I don't think the we works here in the story that I was talking about, and I don't think I fit in that we either. And I think nature culture, I'm not even entering that discussion in relation to that region, and ecosystem services. Matt and I were actually in a workshop earlier this year in Delhi, which was on climate change and discussing agency in government. And I guess different folks see things differently, and whatever helps.